Rivers and harbours have a long history as key infrastructure in Australia's cities. Indeed, they were the first transport corridors in our cities. Our settlements were intentionally focused on waterways in Australia. Before we had rail and automobile cities, we had waterway-based cities. So building on some of the things that Adrian and Anna have pointed out, as well as our other panel members, I want you to think about an alternative transport option, because I think really that the transport problems we have in Hobart today are about a failure of imagination. More than anything else, they're a failure of imagination, to imagine different ways of doing things, to move outside of the current rut that we're stuck in. So I've lived in Perth. I grew up in Perth, a highly car-dependent city. I was there when they were thinking of closing the last viable rail line in Perth, and it was public advocacy that not only saved that rail line, but electrified it. And then several more followed, a northern suburbs and then a southern suburbs rail line. So I've seen what's possible. I've lived in Los Angeles for almost a decade. That city, the most car-dependent city on the planet, virtually, is adopting public transport and rail to get out of some of the problems that it faces at the moment. And I've lived on the Gold Coast. I'm very familiar with southeast Queensland. I saw trams and other forms of public transport being adopted there, and it's a highly car-dependent city. So I think really this last scenario is about moving beyond that failure of imagination and imagining Hobart a little differently. I think part of the attraction of Hobart, the reason why it's so popular with Chinese tourists, is it has amazing feng shui. And feng shui is a Chinese word, two words actually. Feng is wind and shui is water. We're a water city. We have the most incredible harbour and natural river here. In fact, Hobart's probably Australia's best kept secret when it comes to cities. So this last scenario is about a major rethink of Hobart as a river city. Ferries are viable transport modes. San Francisco, and Hobart reminds me a lot of San Francisco and its topography, San Francisco is rolling out ferries at the moment. New York has ferries. Sydney has ferries, viable ferry networks, and so too does Brisbane. In fact, Brisbane's a really good case example. So Brisbane only introduced its ferries in 1996. I thought they were a lot more recent than that. By 2008, more than 6 million people had already used that ferry system. It's comprised of 25 terminals, and it has a fleet of ferries that are both catamarans and single-hull ferries. Their top speed is 26 knots, so it gets to Anna's point about it needs to be convenient and fast and reliable, as well as being safe and efficient. They can carry 162 passengers, and Adrian tells me they cost roughly, well, in that ballpark of $4 to $8 million each. That's a hell of a lot more affordable than $100 million per kilometre for other transport modalities. Building ferry terminals in Hobart wouldn't require the scale of property acquisitions that we would see in the kind of big build scenario either. And Mona and the Mona ferries have shown us that ferries can work. Who's ridden the Mona ferry? Just a show of hands. It's pretty awesome, isn't it? You know, you get to see the city from a different vantage point. So I'm not spruiking this as the only or preferred or single best mode of transport for us to think about in the scenarios. Indeed, ferries would have to build upon some of these other scenarios that we've seen. The terminal costs for ferries is about 8 to 10 million, although in Brisbane more recently they've blown out to about 15 million. But the most recent ferry terminals in Brisbane have been provided by developers, not by state or local government. And the reason is the developers wanted to have the ferries at their doorstep. It means the sales are higher for their product. People like to take ferry to development. The ferry network could also be set up as being carbon neutral. So here's another challenge for you to get outside this failure of imagination. We have Scandinavian countries that have shown us we could, if we wanted to, have Australia's first carbon neutral transportation system. Fully carbon neutral. I mean, we did at one point. We had Australia's first electrified tram network, one of the first cities in the Southern Hemisphere to have trams. If we look at the old photographs of Hobart, we see the port played an integral part in city life. And the collapse of the Tasman Bridge briefly brought back ferries as a viable mode of transport. So what are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about $26 million per annum is the running costs of Brisbane's ferries at the moment. They lease back the fleet. Heavy weather could pose some challenges in Hobart if we had ferries visiting some parts of the city, and they might have to compete with buses as well. We don't want this transport mode to compete with other public transport systems. We want it to complement those public transport systems. But we don't have to worry about dedicated rights of way on roads for ferries. They can go wherever they want. Right? We can have smart ferry systems where your mobile phone will tell you how far away the ferry is. That technology exists off the shelf, just like this technology I'm showing you here. Moreover, you could take your bicycle on ferries. You don't have the kind of space limitation that you have on light rail, for example. And if we set up the city in the right way with a ferry system, and we imagine building on our water-based city that we already have, we could see potentially ferry stops at Dodgers Ferry. We could see parts of the city that are not currently well served by public transport, like Bridgewater, get access through ferries. And we're not just talking a linear ferry, for example, between Bridgewater and Kingston, but also cross-river ferries. So, for example, you might be able to go from Howrah or Tranmere to Sandy Bay. And again, I'm not advocating this as a single solution. It would have to be integrated with bus and cars and other modes of transport. But kiss and ride for ferries does sound pretty sexy, doesn't it, as the introduction gave us. So to wrap up, this looks like a cost-effective system of public transport for Hobart. It's certainly a beautiful waterway. It would put our city on the map internationally to have a carbon-neutral electric ferry transport system. Many of the submissions we got pointed to ferries. People talked about the importance of maybe thinking about ferry terminals at Macquarie Point and converting Macquarie Point into a ferry transit centre. Other submissions pointed to issues with the first and last mile transit links. And I'm sure there's people in the audience already thinking, well, ferries can't go uphill, Professor Byrne. No, they can't. We know that. They're linked only to the waterways. But with first and last mile systems like autonomous vehicles connected to ferries, that would work really well. And then finally, people pointed to the need to have bicycles and storage lockers and showers at these facilities. And if we return to Brisbane, we can see that using something called value capture, we could probably almost get the system to pay for itself. If we have transit-oriented ferry developments, encouraging that mixed-use 5 to 7 story development that Anna talked about, near the foreshore, who wouldn't want to live near the river after all? It's a beautiful view. We could capture some of that increased property value back. Research tells us these values are in the ballpark of between 4 and 15% increase in property values 1 kilometre from ferry terminals in Brisbane. So we know that there is certainly an economic impact from a system like this.